Of course, after the events of October 7th, my mind was drawn once it began to clear of the fog. My mind was drawn to Bialik. I took it right off the shelf. And then in those terrible, terrible first days of the war, right there on my computer, I saw my friend, Professor Ilan Troen. In 2018, Ilan and his wife Carol and his brother Saul and his sister-in-law traveled with us at Beit Agnon and together with some of you to Ukraine, which was really a fabulous, fabulous trip. Everybody that was on that trip still talks about it, and people that have come with us on our other trips to other places we've gone know that people talk about that particular summer's tour of Ukraine, of Galicia, of Agnon's Buchach, from Kiev down to Odessa. Talk about it as it was a really fantastic experience. While they were with us, Ilan and his family took a little excursion. They left the group for a day in search of his grandmother's shtetl. And what he found there was very remarkable. And when they came back and rejoined the group and told us the story, it impacted all of us. But in that eerie way that passed as prologue, and history just keeps, if not repeating itself, then rhyming with itself. It all came crashing back in horrific ways on October 7th, when Deborah and Shlomi Matias, Deborah is Ilan and Carol's daughter, and Shlomi is their son-in-law, were killed in Kibbutz Cholit on the morning of Simchat Torah of October 7th. And among the traumas of that experience was that, we recall, it seems like so long ago now. It seems like eons ago that we've been in this maze. It took many days until the bodies of the Kedoshim were recovered, were identified, and were given over to the families for burial. So during those days, Ilan, it was about 10 days or so. Yes. Ilan, because he's American, because he served for many years as a professor of modern Jewish history at Brandeis University. Now, for many years in Israel, he's been at Ben Gurion University. But because he's such an insightful historian, he was able to bring some of those lessons to bear on our current moment. And he was interviewed on I think every network, every newspaper, every place you looked, there was Ilan through his trauma, through his grief, speaking out about this. And what he said reached back to our trip together with Beit Agnon in Ukraine. So because we're talking about the meaning of pogrom, I wanted to ask, we invited Ilan to join us tonight to share a few words before we turn our attention to the poem. So Ilan, for you and for Carol, I was with you at the Shiva. It meant so much. I can't tell you, I left your house in Omer, and I drove out of Omer to the gas station, and I pulled over, and I cried my eyes out because I gained so much strength from you guys. And I don't know how you do it, but we can only bow our heads in respect to the burden you're bearing. And I haven't even told the whole story because I want everyone to hear it from you. So I turn the microphone over to you.
Thank you, Jeffrey. Actually, I owe you a debt of gratitude. That was a remarkable trip. It was probably the best educational trip I've taken in my life. And it gave me the frame of reference for understanding something of what took place here in the Negev. I'm speaking to you from Omer, which is about an hour and 20 minutes from Jerusalem, from where I think Jeffrey is, and about 45 seconds from Gaza. And so right in back of the wall, there is a bomb shelter.
45 seconds as the rocket flies.
As the rocket flies. And we've used it more than once, unfortunately. Let me get right to the story, except to say that it was that trip where I was able to visit particularly my grandmother's village of Drozhne, which is just south of Rivne in today's Ukraine, but used to be Rovna in yesteryear's Poland. That gave me the frame of reference for understanding what I studied as a kid growing up in Boston, studying with Arnie Band, also a noted scholar of Agnon, where we also
Not,
studied,
yeah,
where
not
we,
also a noted scholar. He is the preeminent scholar of Agnon, and I'm also someone who deals with Agnon.
I
Let's
know
keep
that.
the hierarchy clear here. Yeah.
I know that. And we're also with whom I studied when I must have been just past bar mitzvah, because I went to a Hebrew high school in parallel to my regular high school, where I studied Ira Harega. And I'll finish the short comments that I have to make with how Ir HaHarega resonated with me as we were doing the Shiva, doing Shachrit, one of the mornings on the deck at my home. So there's a cycle here, and you're partly responsible for inserting me in that cycle, so thank you. Our daughter and a son-in-law and their three children were in Kibbutz Cholit. These kids are idealistic kids. Who goes to a kibbutz these days? These are people, they're fundamentally educators. They're people who were out there in the demonstrations. These were people who sent their kids to a joint Hebrew Arabic school with the idea is that it would be well to understand our neighbors, since this is the part of the world in which we live. Lefties, they weren't, but people who believed in peace and accommodation, they were, and educators to the core. Going to a small community and making the desert bloom was an ideal, and they fulfilled that ideal, and they were fortunate to live there for around 10 years, knowing the dangers. About 300 meters from their home was the fence between Gaza and Israel. So they understood where they went to, but their idealism took them there, as did so many of the other people who, ironically, were victims on that Shabbat morning of Simchat Torah. What happened? We live in an age of cell phones. We actually were there when the event took place, because at 6:30 we were awoken, like many other people in Israel, by the ping, ping, ping that were telling us that there were rockets on the way to many different places, and we realized they were also rockets to our kids' place. We were soon on the phone with Deborah, and for under the hour, and the last part of the conversation was her saying that she's hearing shouting in Arabic. She hears shots. She hears glass being broken. And in fact, they broke into despite attempts to barricade, they broke into their so-called safe room, and she was killed together with her husband. And she fell down. She pushed our grandson down and fell on him, first a blanket and then him, and he was able to hide, but a bullet penetrated her and entered into his abdomen, fortunately missing vital organs. That rest of the day, we were on the telephone with our grandson. By texting, we told him not to talk. He had to hide. Several times during the day, these murderers came back, and as reported by our grandson, they laughed, they joked. They weren't satisfied that they had killed these two people. Just in case anybody else was alive, they came back in the afternoon and set the house to fire, to use the American expression, to smoke out anybody who may have survived. That young man who we met that night at Soroka Hospital in Beersheba was gray because he was covered with soot from the flames that enveloped the house. He had by then moved to a corner near the laundry, and somehow he was miraculously saved. The girls, who were 19 and 21, because of the rules of the kibbutz, they had their own dwelling. So the children survived, and there were 3 orphans. Even as there were orphans in Kishinev, there were orphans and many orphans of what happened, the Simchat Torah. And it'd be worthwhile reflecting upon what happened to the orphans of Kishinev as to what happens to the orphans in today's Israel. I could go on and tell you the gruesome stories, the gruesome details, and they are gruesome. I mean, what does it mean to be covered with your mother's blood and yourself to be bleeding and to be terrified and not knowing how to hide? Or do you escape? Do you make a run for it? That whole day, the whole family was on a chat with him and texting him. Some people said, "Hey, Gibor, be heroic. Don't give up." Other people, the psychologist told him how to breathe. There's a physician in the family that inquired as to his wound and how we might stench the blood and so on. That's the beginning of a really terrible, terrible story. What I want to make a point is that Our daughter is buried about 100 meters and a century and 20 years, not a century and 20 years, a century from her grandmother, who was a survivor of another pogrom. Her grandmother, my mother, survived a pogrom in Drajne, near Rovno, in March 1919. Kishinev was actually a small event. A much larger event took place in 1919 when 150,000 Jews in the Ukraine were killed and set off a mass movement across the Jewish world, including to Palestine, North America, Argentina, you name it. In short, there have been cycles of pogroms. Kishinev was the archetypal one, but there were even more major pogroms thereafter. And the story of my grandmother and my daughter is much the same. 3 children, 2 older girls and a boy, were left to fend for themselves until they could join their father in America. In the case of our grandchildren, there were 2 older girls and a boy. And I can tell you that from my mother's generation, that experience bound them together as nothing else could have, perhaps. And as I see this generation of my daughter's children, my son-in-law's children, they too are bound together by this terrible experience. And I know from my mother's experience, it never left her. She did not experience the Shoah, but her mother saved my grandmother saved my mother's life. We don't know the story. Was it she was pushed under the bed? She was pushed out of the window. Somehow she managed to survive the pogrom and live some years before she came to see her father again in America. She lived as an orphan. Being an orphan is no fun. There's nobody to share confidence with, the kind of psychological, financial, other measure of support. And we now have 3 orphans, but in case, if you like, we have 6 children. Our son-in-law had a big family, so there are a lot of cousins and uncles and aunts. And one of the differences between the pogrom in Europe and the pogrom here is, first of all, there's family and there's a state. The children from Kishinev had no place really to go. Several of them came to Palestine, and Palestine became the orphanage for the orphans of Kishinev, and that founded ultimately a village called Ben Shemen. In our case, there are places to go to, and there's a very well-developed system. So that's the positive, if you like, part of it. But the negatives are so overwhelming, because after all, what is a pogrom? A pogrom is not a military campaign. It's not a war. A pogrom is a word that comes from the Russian. It entered into Yiddish in 1881, 1882, and it means the big noise that's in the storm. And it was Sufot Tanegev, as it was called in Hebrew, the storm that overwhelmed Eastern Europe. And pogrom came into Yiddish, and from Yiddish it came into other languages. And it was the way in which Jews in 1881 described their experience of being attacked by paramilitary groups, not a real army, who sought out civilians just because they were Jews. A pogrom is a special word that's used in the connection of hatred against people who are other, and most particularly against people who are Jews. So this is a pogrom that we witnessed in October in Israel, like the pogrom in the Ukraine in 1919 and the archetypal pogrom in 1903 in Kishinev. One other thing before I finish, and I know that you have a lot of important literature to do.
No, take your time.
No, I'm gonna finish. I've always enjoyed listening to you, Jeffrey, and I don't want to deprive the other people on this Zoom of that opportunity, even for a minute. When we were doing Shiva, and there are enough boys in our family and both families that we had our own minyan, and then together with the neighbors. And one Shachrit that week, when the bodies were finally identified, though there were so many bodies, it took 10 days to identify our daughter. Nobody could cope with the amount of people who were killed. And they were civilians. They didn't have dog tags. So the method that one had to go through was dental records, DNA. You couldn't make a mistake. So that when the ceremony actually took place and it was decided that they would be buried together rather than separately, rather than two funerals, he was discovered in 7 days, our daughter in 10 days, identified. We then had a shiva, and one of the days of the shiva, as we had the davening on our deck, and we have a beautiful yard with citrus trees, pomegranates. We've made the desert bloom. I thought of Bialik. I thought of what I learned from Arnie Band. Arnie Band, when he taught us Ira Harega, singled out a particular line, and he pointed out that Bialik used the shin because it is a harsh sound. And the line is one of the most famous lines in modern Hebrew poetry. Hashemesh zorcha, excuse me accent, Hashita porcha, v'hashochet shochat. That the sun shone, the acacia tree blossomed, and the slaughterer slaughtered. At that moment when I thought of the poem, at that very moment when I thought of the poem, because the poem speaks of the natural beauty. It was springtime in Kishinev. Well, it was beautiful fall here in Israel, and our beautiful yard and the trees and the blossoms and a clear blue Mediterranean sky was stunning. At that moment, a jet flew over, and we knew where it was going. It was going to Gaza to bomb those people who had murdered our children. And I thought that if Bialik were here, and I need your help, Jeffrey, that he would have added a phrase. He wouldn't have stopped with the normalcy, which was part of the outrage. He would have said, Matos shoeg, and the jet plane roars, because the difference between Bialik's Ira Harega and our experience here in Israel 100 years later, 120 years later, is that we can fight back. The poem is full of an accusation of those Jews who watched women being raped, of their community being destroyed and being powerless. And I had a sense that we were different. Right now, my daughter, Deborah, has 3 nephews and nieces fighting in the Israeli army, and another week, another one is going to join them. And the kind of solidarity that exists here in knowing that we will not take this down defenseless, and we will not have to go to another country. We will not have to scour the world for a place where we can find refuge. Refuge is here. We've had the tragedy of this event of anti-Semitism pursuing us to Zion, but we will not take it lying down. And so there's a measure of satisfaction in being together with 7 million plus other Jews in our own country, able to defend ourselves, and understanding that anti-Semitism may persist, but we can react differently, and that no Bialik would have to accuse us as Chaim Nachman Bialik accused his fellow Jews.
We're about to see
120 years ago.
Ilan and Carol, we are, so many of us online, I know, are people who know you personally. So many of us online were people that were with you in Ukraine a couple of years ago when we had that remarkable experience together. And, all of us worldwide were with you and with all the other families of those who were lost, and certainly also of the Chatufim, who, we're on Spilkis tonight. We're recording this, the night between what was meant to be the first release of hostages and is hoped to be the night before, who we hope it will all, be what we want it to be. But we thank you for your strength and for your insights. And now we'll turn our attention to Bialik, and to Kishinev.